Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Tyson James, president of Sound Faith Consulting. I'm thrilled to be joined today by one of our esteemed clients, Dr. Donald T. Williams. One of the reasons why I'm so happy that he's with us today is because I think he is a phenomenal scholar and somebody that you guys need to know. He's not as well known as he should be. And so we're hoping that this interview, as well as a lot of promotional work, will help remedy that. His work needs to be more broadly received, and I'm just thrilled to be able to introduce him to you guys. So today it's all about answering the question, who is Dr. Donald T. Williams really? Dr. Williams, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Ellen Sila Lumen Omentiavo. A star shines on the hour of our meeting.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, we're going to be talking about some where some of that language comes from here in a bit. But first, I want to ask you a question that I ask everyone, and it's just as an icebreaker and something to dig way, way, way back in the depths of our lives. What is your earliest memory?
It's got to be the earliest because you'll understand why when I describe it. I'm walking into my parents' bedroom. I woke up early in the morning. They're still in bed. And I walk into their bedroom, which I've done plenty of times. And I suddenly realize I'm looking over the top of the bed at them without having to go up on tiptoe. Meaning I've grown so that my eyes are now at this new level. And it was like, oh, this growing thing actually works. And it's like the world has just totally shifted into this new form. And I was really kind of astonished by it. And that's, I can't have been more than about 3 because of the height that I had to be in order for the thing to happen. So that is that would have been 69 years ago. So
3 years
back,
old.
In ancient times, that was right after one of my conversations with Chaucer.
That is really early. I've asked that question of hundreds of people, and you'd be surprised at the different ages that people can recall their earliest memory. Sometimes it's really early, 2 or 3 years old. Sometimes it's not as late as 9 or 10. Some people don't have any memories before then.
I don't have clear connected memories until I'm like 4.5 or 5. But that little snippet stuck in my brain for some reason, and it has to be another year or 2 earlier.
Fantastic. Well, let's peel back the layers of the onion that is Dr. Williams.
The Vidalia, of course.
Vidalia, yeah, so sweet and Southern. Yes. For those of you watching, Dr. Williams is out in Georgia, so yes, hence the southernness. There is a picture of you swinging a batleth, which, for those of you who don't know Star Trek, it's the weapon of choice for the Klingons. He's fluent in Klingon.
It is a good day to die.
Awesome. Where in the world did you get a batleth, first of all?
I was notorious for many things during my long college teaching career, one of which was making Star Trek references. And so when I retired, a good number of my students, current and former students, got together and threw me a retirement party, and they went together and got me a batleth, which is a Klingon honor sword, of course. And it's hanging in my hall. At the end of the hall, it's hanging on a hanger that has a plaque which says, in honor of Dr. Williams, in honor of Dr. Williams' retirement, in memory of many victories. So
Well,
I
I'm
that was
sure
about the coolest thing they could have done.
that is a really cool gift. I don't think I've ever received a gift quite like that.
Well, you still got a few years to go. You may pull that off and more.
All right. So
Maybe you'll get a lightsaber or something.
oh man. Speaking of Star Trek, though, what are your top 3 Star Trek series?
Oh, series. Well, the original series has to be number 1 because the characters, Spock, Kirk, and McCoy, with the other guys too, but those 3, they had the best, most interesting, rich friendship and relationships with each other of any people in any television show of any genre ever. And then Next Generation continues the story. And Deep Space Nine would be the 3rd one that I would put up there. I thought it had some of the most interesting characters and some of the most interesting plots of all the series.
Awesome. I think many will agree with you out there.
Yeah.
Good deal. Well, so that's just one facet of Dr. Williams' his connection with Star Trek here. But you know, he's got so much more than that, so many different hats that he's worn. And I just want to read this introduction to your book of poetry, which is called Stars Through the Clouds. We're going to be talking about that book a little more in depth here in a little bit. But in the introduction, you state, "I have appeared before the world, both in flesh and in print, as a college professor, a literary historian, a preacher, a Bible teacher, a missionary, a musician, a culture critic, an apologist, and maybe even as a bit of a theologian." So we are going to talk about the book a little more in a little bit, but first I wanted to ask you about some of these various hats that you've worn. First of all, musician, really? On top of wielding a batleth, you know how to wield an instrument. Do you have any out there that we can listen to, or what instrument do you play?
I play the clarinet. That's my major instrument. Also play the sax, Roke recorder, guitar, electric bass, and vocal cords. So yeah, I was in band in high school and college. I actually started out as a music major. First 2 years I was a music major, and then reality started to set in, and I said to myself, "Don, you're good, but you're not that good. You're never going to be one of the 2 guys who gets hired to play clarinet for the Atlanta Symphony." Yeah. And then I started picturing myself as a middle school band director, and I thought, no way. I love music far too much to ever do that. And so I never subject myself to it. So I switched to an English major. I was interested in English, in history and philosophy, and I picked English because I could take, the way the curriculum was set up, I could take more history and philosophy as an English major than I could take English as a history or philosophy major. And took Greek as my language requirement and used that as a pre-seminary degree. So I from the outside, I look like this totally schizophrenic person who's running down these 2 forking paths both at the same time. Am I going to be a lit person, or am I going to be a pastor and a theologian? And my answer is, well, yeah, I mean, what else would you do? Because the Bible, God's main way of revealing himself to us, of course, the most important way is in Christ, But the main way we have access to that revelation in Christ is a book.
Mm.
And so the better you are at reading, at being able to fully absorb what a text can give you and accurately and relate it to other texts and other things. I mean, it's the same skill set really that I'm using uh, on either of those two paths, which to me are simply the same. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and looking down one as far as I could, I tried to travel both and be one traveler. And along I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bit in the undergrowth, then took the other just as fair, though having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that day equally lay, and leaves no step had trodden black. I kept the first for another day, but knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took both of them. Uh, Frost took the one less traveled by, and that's made all the difference. But because it's I'm doing the same thing. I happen to make most of my living by expounding Milton and Shakespeare and Chaucer uh, rather than expounding Scripture. But an expositor of text takes both of those two things and wheels them together. And while Providence had me end up in college teaching to make most of my living, I am ordained in the Evangelical Free Church of America and pastored churches and continued to do a lot of preaching, which I still do. And I spent um, probably 8 or so summers out of the last 14 or 15 doing pastoral training in places like Uganda, Kenya, and India. In Africa, you know, they're, the church is growing faster than they can train leaders. And so they have a lot of pastors that have a lot of zeal, but they have a high school education and no formal training in theology or sermon construction or any of that kind of thing. So I'll go and I'll go to a centrally located village, and the pastors from that region will gather in the host church, and I'll spend all day teaching Bible survey and hermeneutics, the science of interpretation, a little theology and sermon prep, etc. And then on Sunday, I'll go around to as many of their churches as they can and preach so that hopefully they can see me doing what I've been talking about all week, and then move on to a new location the next week. And so I've been about as heavily involved in theological education, especially overseas, as I have in doing my official job, which was being the medieval and Renaissance guy in the English department. It's been fun. It's kept me out of, well, I don't know if I could say it's kept me out of trouble. It has kept me off the street. But yeah, it's never a dull moment. And now I've been retired for a couple of years and still taking every opportunity I can to communicate the absolute wonder and glory of the gospel and of the God who gave us that good news in Christ. And every which way I can, whether it's in a sermon, a poem, a lecture, a scholarly article, a book, it just deserves to be better known, better understood, and proclaimed. And so what little ability I have, I keep throwing into that and
Hmm.
we'll see if
Well,
any
I'll
of
tell
it.
you what, for somebody who's been retired for a couple of years, you couldn't tell. You've got so many irons in the fire, and you're so prolific. It just seems like you're constantly thinking, you're constantly putting out content.
Well,
You're
I'm definitely constantly thinking, and I have some opportunities to speak, etc. I should be doing more, but it's a little tough because uh, where I live, there are no churches of my denomination within driving distance. And in this part of the country, if you're not a Southern Baptist, you don't exist.
mm,
You know, which is pretty much the way that goes. So yeah, I have some opportunities, and I take advantage of them as I can.
well,
But
I hope if you're any
retirement didn't
pastor,
start well at all. It was I was fixing to be 70, and wasn't tired of teaching at all. I was a little bit tired of committee meetings and grading papers. But that year I had opportunities like I'd never had before. I had invitations to teach and preach in England, in France, uh, several places across the United States, and Poland. And I was sitting there saying, I think I really should be free to do this stuff. It's time to pull the trigger. So I put in the letter saying this would be my last year, and in response to that, the COVID virus was released upon the world. And that entire agenda, which was my reason for retiring, went up in smoke. I didn't get to do any of it.
oh man,
Some of those opportunities came back again, others were gone forever. But that first year, it was rough because I was just sitting home asking the Lord, what is the point of this? Uh, it almost seemed diabolical, like a personal affront that the universe had decided to come after me for some reason. The timing could not have been worse.
Yeah, well, you said that if you're not part of the Southern Baptist Church out there, you don't exist. Hopefully, if there are some people out there who are pastors or on staff at Baptist churches, I want to highly encourage you guys to book Dr. Williams, bring him in because he has a plethora of knowledge, and he's just a wonderful resource that's going to help your congregations um, get back in touch with the enchantment of theology. I
Mm.
think that's one thing that I really get out of your writing is that, like you said, the primary way that God communicates with us is through Christ and his word, his written word. And the scripture is an enchanting book, collection of writings. And what you draw out in so many of your books is that connection between good literature and theology, that which connects us to God. And so I think that is so needed in the church today, and in a generation that is disenchanted and disillusioned and debauched. We need something of higher quality, and I think you can provide that.
Well, the Bible is important, not because it can let you win arguments, primary use a lot of people make of it, but because it's about Jesus. And he actually deserves all of our obedience, all of our love, all of our devotion, all of our worship, all of it. He really does. And the great thing about coming to understand the scriptures better and coming to understand theology better, which is simply what the scriptures teach us, is that it shows you more of Jesus, shows you more of who he is. And and leaves you on your face at his feet,
Mm.
which is the tallest a man can be, is on his face at the feet of Jesus. That's when he's standing the tallest. Uh,
Absolutely.
and we, there are a lot of things that you can use the Bible for, and there are a lot of things that it's intended to give us, actually. You can use it to learn how to have a better marriage and learn how to make all kinds of things in your lives better, because it's the secret to understanding the way we were created to be by our Creator. And so it's the secret to human thriving. But all of that means nothing if you miss the central thing, which is uh, the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ, which will pretty soon reduce you to speechlessness, which is why you need the Bible, because it lets you start talking about it again.
Mm. See, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Such beautiful phrasing, and we don't get enough of that in the church these days. um, so, just kind of following up a little bit on your teaching career,
Mm-hmm.
you are professor emeritus at Toccoa Falls College. Um, as you said, you kind of pursued this dual path, right? You are a theologian, you are an educator, and I wonder, just after so many years of teaching, what about being a professor was most challenging for you?
Um, Trying to reach this, all of the students. I remember coming to Toccoa Falls College. I had taught several years at the University of Georgia. Go Dogs! National champions, fixing to be 3 times in a row, Lord willing. I taught there several years, and I taught in some high schools and other places. And I got to Toccoa in my first semester there, because it's a small Christian college, right? So my first semester there, I had the best student and the worst student that I've ever had, and they were in the same class. Somehow I have to challenge and stimulate and inspire that best guy without losing the guy on the other end of that scale, because being a small college, like, we didn't have multiple layers of remedial courses or things like that, which a big university can afford to have. So they're all thrown in there together, and so that was a challenge. And trying to take the students in the bottom half and ensure that they get real benefit out of what's going on. It just got harder and harder and harder, because the bottom kept sinking, because uh, the high schools simply quit bothering even trying. The public schools, they didn't even try to teach grammar anymore. I mean, I taught a course, upper level course for the teacher ed department called Grammar for Teachers. It was specifically a course in making sure the kids who were going out to be high school English teachers and middle school English teachers knew their grammar and were able to teach it. And I would have a couple of students out of the class of a couple of dozen. There'd be a couple that were grammar nerds who could have taught the course themselves if they wanted to. And then half of them, I would start off, and on the first day of class, they wouldn't even know what the parts of speech were. They wouldn't even know what a part of speech. If I asked you for the part of speech, they wouldn't even know what I was talking about. Nouns, pronouns, verbs, etc. These kids got A's and B's in high school, and they knew nothing. And so I'm trying to do grammar school work with kids are in college. Now, the kids who were homeschooled and the kids from private schools, whether Christian or secular, they had high school educations and they were ready to hit the ground running. And half of the class, more than half of the class, the kids from the public schools had been the victims of educational malpractice. It wasn't their fault. I mean, they just weren't exposed to, they weren't expected to know these things. And so trying to remember that it's not the kid's fault that he's this ignorant. Because he's not the enemy, he's the victim. And the person I'm angry with is other people in administration and teaching, etc., who never gave him the foundation. And that's gotten worse progressively every year. So, I'm I think pretty good at explaining things, and pretty good at working with the good students, but relating to the lower group in a way that expressed the love of Christ and that was actually helpful to them. That was a constant challenge. And I got less bad at it as time went on, but you do it for the few good ones and the few not so good ones who actually get the vision and are getting it and are going to do something with it. That's what makes it worthwhile, even if there's only one of those guys.
Yeah, I know a lot of teachers are dealing with that today. A lot of kids, especially in the elementary schools and middle schools, who, because of COVID and quarantine, they were taken out of school altogether. Schools closed down. They are missing a year or two of education, and so they're being put back into school with a huge learning gap. And I know there are a lot of teachers who are struggling with the same thing. It's not their fault.
And a lot of the public schools weren't teaching them anything before that.
Right.
They really didn't.
That's another
problem. By being out of school, but that has made the challenge even worse. And of course, COVID hit as I was on my way out, so I didn't deal directly with the kids who were impacted by that when they were in high school. But I can just imagine the significance of this problem. Yeah.
All right. Well, that was kind of a downer. Let's go to an pickup here. What was most rewarding about it, or was that kind of both the most challenging and the most rewarding? Was reaching those students who were behind? Yeah.
The most rewarding thing is the relationships that you make with students who become more than a student, who become disciples. And then to see them go out into the world and show that they actually did get the vision and they're running with it. They're doing something about it. They're kids 30 years ago that are still my friends.
Wow.
There are people teaching high school, college, people in the ministry who are doing it and doing it differently and doing it better because I was part of their life. And there's nothing cooler than that.
Awesome. Well, let's talk about some of your published work because you have a lot of it.
It's a
And
start.
it's a start. And yeah, well, I was going to say, you're not slowing down, and we're going to talk about some more stuff that's going to be coming down the pipe here pretty soon. But just starting with some of the stuff that you've already put out, you've got this little guy called An Encouraging Thought, The
Mm-hmm.
Christian Worldview and the Writings of J.R. Tolkien. In the beginning of the book, which is, I mean, it's not that big of a book, but it is packed. Um, in the beginning, you describe some really important things that happened in the summer of 1968. And they're personal things. And so I'm just wondering, to share with people who you are, could you just briefly summarize what happened in the summer of 1968 and how it affected sort of the trajectory of your life?
The summer of 68 is the summer between my junior and senior year of high school. And moving into it, I was struggling a little bit spiritually uh, because I was asking questions, and it wasn't so much that I wasn't getting answers to them. It was the fact that there was an attitude to the question. It was like if I was asking, how do we know this is true? And the response was, well, if you were spiritual, you wouldn't be asking questions like that. You just need to read your Bible more and pray harder. And that was not having the effect that was intended, not anything close. Because my reaction was, if the people who are the most serious about this belief are so insecure that they're threatened by the questions of a snot-nosed teenager, how can it possibly be true? How can it possibly be real? Now, I had met the Lord when I was much younger, and He had hold of me, and He didn't let me go, but I was struggling, and it just so happened that that was the time when the Tolkien craze hit America full blast, and so everybody's reading The Lord of the Rings and freaking out about how good it is, and so I pick it up and start reading it, and I'm as drawn into it and as enchanted by it as anybody, because it's simply the greatest uh, fantasy novel ever written. Uh, so I have no idea who Tolkien is. I have no idea that he's even a Christian. But as I'm reading this book, I'm starting to have thoughts like, if a Christian ever really came alive to the great questions of life and to the beauty of nature and of words, this might be how he would write. Uh, then I would say, nah. Based on the anti-intellectualism of the kind of fundamentalist circles that I was in, I thought that just couldn't be. And so uh, I did what you do when you meet a writer that moves you deeply. I read everything by him I could get my hands on, which outside of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings back then wasn't very much. But there was a book called The Tolkien Reader, and it had a chapter called An Essay on Fairy Stories, in which Tolkien was talking about the genre that he was working in and giving insights into that type of literature, which was interesting in its own right. But all of a sudden in it, he starts talking about the gospel. And I was like, what? And he said that the gospel was the greatest story ever written because it had the greatest happy ending ever. And he had a technical word he made up for that called eucatastrophe, which he said, when it looks like everything is at its absolute worst and there's no way that things can turn out well, there's a sudden turn where in a way that's totally surprising and yet seems inevitable when it happens, everything suddenly comes right and you have a happy ending. The gospel's got the best one of those ever. And the really neat thing is, it's true. It actually happened. And it was like, whoa, Tolkien's a Christian? Not only is he a Christian, he's using the ideas that the Bible has taught him to understand the world. He's accepting them as true. He's using them as the foundation of his own work, using them to understand the world as if they were true Monday through Saturday and not just on Sunday. And I thought, you can do that? I want to do that. And so it was the turnaround for me. I didn't even know there was such a thing as a Christian worldview at that time, but Tolkien was showing me what it looks like to have one. And then somebody said, hey, if you like Tolkien, you should check out his friend C.S. Lewis. And Lewis is just as deeply Christian in his thinking as Tolkien was, only Lewis is much more explicit and upfront about it. You know, you can't miss it in Lewis. And so I was on the road to understanding that, yes, this is true. And yes, you can build your life on this truth. And yeah, you can do that because Lewis and Tolkien did it. The next year I would discover Francis Schaeffer and learn the phrase Christian worldview. And the rest, as they say, is history. That is pretty pivotal in how I got to be the person that I am today. So you could say I'm still sort of running on the fuel of that moment when I was reading the essay on fairy stories and hit that section on eucatastrophe. Yeah, it's the foundation for everything.
And then from that point, it seems like your love of literature and your love of the Lord just kind of fused together, so that was sort of the point at which you were on a trajectory to be this person, to expound the great truths of the gospel through the various literatures and great texts that have been created throughout history.
You know, I'm not the only person in this conversation who comes up with good phrases. That was about as good a summation of my career as I've ever heard.
Oh, fantastic.
You hit the nails right on the head. Sunk them in the two before with one blow.
There we go. So yeah, we talked about your book about Tolkien. Here's another one, Deeper Magic, the Theology Behind the Writings of C.S. Lewis. So kind of the same thing, but with Lewis. Just another rich book. This is the next book I want to talk about, Inklings of Reality. And a buddy of mine, we just introduced him to you, and he's like looking up your books, and he's just fascinated. He said, I think I'm going to have to be a completionist and get all of Dr. Williams's books now, because they're all so good. And he was like, Inklings of Reality.
I got to stay ahead of him and write.
Well, this guy, he said, he was like, Inklings of Reality, huh? Is he like a big Tolkien Lewis guy? And I was like, maybe a little bit, yeah. So did you intentionally name it that because of the Inklings?
Almost all of my puns are intentional.
Oh, okay. Almost all of them.
So it's not a book directly about the Inklings, but they all play major roles in the development. It's the subtitle really tells you what it's about. Inklings of Reality: Essays Toward a Christian Philosophy of Letters. This is a book about reading. It's about Christians are a people of the book, and that book is central to not only their religion, but it should be central to their life. And the love of that book hopefully opens them up to the love of other books. And so, why should Christians read? What should Christians read? How should Christians read? What should they be getting out of it? The Bible as the central plumb line by which everything else is evaluated, but then the great classics of the past, the great classics of the church and Christian writing, all have their role to play as well. One of the things, I'll just give you one little snippet from that book. Why am I a person, not just a person of one book, but a person of lots of books with that one in the center? And the answer is that when I've been away from the Bible, reading something else, and then come back to the Bible, which I do every day, but when I come back after having been reading some of these other things, stuff jumps off the page at me that I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't broadened my mind. So the Bible has the answers, but if I hadn't read other literature, I would have missed some of the questions. And I think I've benefited greatly from realizing that there were questions I should be asking that the Bible had the only answers to, that I hadn't even been smart enough to ask until I stood on the shoulders of some of those other literary giants.
Fantastic. You mentioned that Christians are a people of the book. They ought to be people who care about language and literature and about reading and writing. We're living in a digital age, that's undeniable, and video is king. So how can the Christian community get back to a culture of reading and appreciating language and literature and writing?
Wow. You just have to do it. I
The
think
Nike approach, just do it.
Parents really need to limit the screen time of their kids. I see people people giving a 3-year-old his own tablet and using it as a babysitter. And I'm not the only person who says, now, obviously, I read lots of text on screens. I put lots of texts on screens. So I'm not against that, but I'm not the only person who has realized it has its role, it has its place, but it's not the same. It's not the same. You process it differently. And many studies, for example, have shown that a student who takes physical notes with a pen on a piece of paper in class gets more of the material, understands more, and retains more than the person who takes notes typing into his laptop or his tablet. And in fact, probably the more different media you use to reinforce the same ideas, listen to it, write it down the old-fashioned way, then transfer that into your computer and use it to create programs with, the more different synapses you fire off, the more different neurons you get involved coming at things from different directions. That's what you're going to remember, and that's what's going to stick in your long-term memory as well as your short-term. I notice kids think they don't need to keep any information in their heads anymore because they can always Google it.
Hmm.
But the problem is, if you don't have stuff actually in your head, you're reading what Google says. How do you know how to interpret it? How do you know the context into which it might fit?
Might not even know the right things to Google if you're not
Right.
remembering certain things.
So we need to have rich intellectual lives going on inside our heads, and um, books as opposed to videos. Excuse me. The thing about a video, or the thing about television, for example, somebody else controls the pace. Okay. So if I'm watching, let's assume that the movie version of The Lord of the Rings was exactly identical to the book. Not one word changed. All the dialogue's there. It's the actual dialogue Tolkien wrote, not some of the lame stuff Peter Jackson stuck in. Uh, and to be fair, he did put a few good things in too, but you can almost tell when somebody's not actually giving the right speech because it doesn't sound like Tolkien wrote it. Um, anyway, when you're reading, you decide when you need to stop and think about something and when you need to move on. Uh, it's much more, it's much less passive. It's a less passive medium
Hmm.
than watching a video. Now, in fact, uh, the movie version leaves out an awful lot, which it had to do, and I'm not against there being a movie version. It has good things in it. It has some things that I don't like so much. But it's got to start with parents. And I see some good signs out there. There are parents who are realizing, yeah, we want our kids to be comfortable and fluent with computer technology, but we can't just park them in front of those screens and let them play video games all day. That needs to be limited, and they need to have uh, physical books as part of their life. And so we have parents beginning to realize this. We have the Christian classical school movement, which and we have a lot of homeschooling families, etc., that are showing that it's not the wave we need to see yet, but there's at least a trickle started to head in the right direction. And so we need to encourage that and keep it going. Obviously, I'm not anti-computer. I'm not anti-electronic medium, anti-social media, because I'd be the biggest hypocrite in the world to be sitting on this screen you're looking at right now saying this stuff if I was. Uh, and I could stand to be better at that stuff. But if we could add the new capacity without losing what we already had, we'd be getting somewhere. Unfortunately, that's been a challenge for a lot of people.
All right, so major advice there, church. Let's help our kids retain a culture of reading and writing and literature by limiting screen time and learning how to balance the screens with books and writing and learning grammar, like you said earlier. Great advice. Um, Going off of the books just a little bit, still in the realm of literature, you do have a blog called The Five Pilgrims, which people can find at thefivepilgrims.com. I'll put that and the links to all of your social media in the description of this video. So all you guys watching, you should definitely follow immediately all of Dr. Williams's pages wherever you can find them. But it looks like you've been publishing blogs there consistently for about 8 years, a long time. So tell us just a little bit about the purpose of that blog and maybe a few things that you've learned about writing blogs along the way.
Well, the Five Pilgrims refers to the five guys that went together to create the thing, one of whom was one of my former students. And so it was him, me, another professor he had after he left Dakota and went to grad school, and a couple of that guy's kids were the five. That's where the Five Pilgrims came from. And what happened was, I got into it because I wanted to support Brian, who was my student. He said, "Hey, we're going to have this blog. You want to come join us?" And I said, "Sure." Well, they all started. A lot of them started having kids and getting into the busiest part of their life, and so it's like I'm the only one, practically the only one of the five who's still posting anything. But it gave me an outlet for some shorter pieces. Actually, I put pieces on there that are probably too long to be in a blog, but it's what I've got. So it's one more way of giving some people a chance to hear the message. And like I said before, I try. It's not about me. The truth of the Christian faith is so life-changing and so wonderful. It just needs to get out there, and so every which way I can, and the blog is included in that.
Fantastic. Yeah, definitely go check that out, thefivepilgrims.com. How many articles do you think you have there now? It's got to be hundreds and hundreds, right?
Well, if you're right, and I've been doing it for 8 years because I haven't been keeping track. 8 times 52 would be 416.
Yeah, fantastic.
So something along that line.
Wow.
Because I put something up. Well, actually, I put 2 up a week. On Monday, I have a prose one, and then on Thursday, I do a poetry-based post. So 832-ish total blog posts are out there, and
Wow.
they haven't crashed the internet yet, so you can still go and find them.
All right. Well, that is a lot of content, so I'm sure everybody can find something there. Going back to this wonderful book, your book on poetry, it's called Stars Through the Clouds. I love that cover, by the way. I went camping in Utah not too long ago, and it reminds me of that. Just gorgeous. In the introduction, you make this very strong statement that the main thing you were put on this planet to do was to write this book. That's mind-blowing to me because growing up, I was good at several different things and had a lot of different hobbies and passions and things, and it was hard for me to figure out what direction to take. It seems like you knew at some point that this was one of the things that you were meant to do. So how long have you known that about yourself, that this book needed to be made and that was one of your main purposes?
Well, it goes back, not sure when I actually would have started saying that, but the process goes back to, and the story, I tell the story in Inklings of Reality, actually. There was this, I was in about the 10th grade. It was this long weekend, short holiday, and my family went camping up in the North Georgia mountains. And it was one of those wonderful fall days we get over here with the bright yellow and red leaves, orange, just sifting through the air, kind of like snowflakes, coming down, and I had a miserable trip as I picked up some stomach bug, and I spent the whole trip making mad dashes from the camper to the outhouse and back. And then finally, I was started getting better the last morning before we had to leave. We were leaving, and so my mom took pity on me and made my sisters do all the work of breaking camp and getting ready to go back, and said, go have fun. And so I went for a hike, and I had like 2 hours. I had to be back at camp by noon because we had to leave so that we could get back home in time for my dad, who was working third shift. We had to get home in time for him to get to work. So I absolutely have to be back. All right. Well, what do I do? Well, okay. So if I divide the time in half, that gives me the exact minute, right, that I have to turn around. And so I'm following this trail up from the Tallulah River campground. It's following the Tallulah River, which is a mountain stream rolling over the rocks and little waterfalls, and getting deeper into the hills, into the wilderness, and those fall leaves just coming down. And then you get to that point. This is the point where I'm supposed to turn around, right? But there's no way you can turn around without seeing what's over the next hill. And so, okay, I'll cheat a few minutes, and then I'll walk faster on the way back. And then there's no way you can turn around without seeing what's around the next curve. And so I cheated a little more. And there finally came the point where that wasn't going to work anymore. It's like, okay, you really do have to turn around now, or you're going to be in big trouble. Because you're going to have to do some running on the way back. And so I got back, and it was like somehow the value of that whole experience of beauty and peace of the wilderness, and you want more of it, but you can't have it because life is happening and pulls you out. And somehow the finiteness of the smallness of that amount of time that you're given makes the whole thing even stronger and more valuable. I couldn't put that into words, even the words I just used at the time, but it's just boiling inside of me in the car on the way back. All right, so back to school the next morning. And like any studious high school person, I'm doing my homework in homeroom before the bell rings for the first period of class. And it includes reading a couple of these poems by this guy named Robert Frost. I already quoted one of them. 2 rows diverged in a yellow wood. And wishing I could travel both and be one traveler, long I stood and looked down one as far as I could. How did he know that? And then the other one is stopping by woods on a snowy evening. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest of evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go. How did he know that? Like, the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep. So it was like I get whacked in the head with the fact that this experience that had been so full of insight, but the insight was incomplete because I couldn't express it. I couldn't figure out what it was. I couldn't put it into words. And this guy could. He could not only articulate it, but he could put it into words that were so perfect that you can't change a syllable without messing it up. And the form of the poem becomes like a receptacle to hold the experience, the
Mm.
meaning, the significance and the meaning of that experience, to preserve it so it can be revisited later or handed on to somebody else. Like me, I had no clue who Robert Frost was. I didn't even know he had just died a couple of years ago. He died, I think, in 63, 64. This was about 65, 66. But I knew that if I ever met this guy and we got to talking about hiking in the woods, we would understand each other. Okay. So this is what poetry can do. It can take things that seem too deep for words and put them into words that actually communicate, and communicate in such a way that you're getting not just an idea, but the idea incarnated in the experience. And as I did with Tolkien and the Christian worldview, I said, I want to do that. And so I started trying to do it. And the early poems were pretty bad, as you could imagine. But I kept reading Frost and discovered other poets and started informally sitting at their feet, paying attention to how they did it and how they got these effects and what worked, etc. And so eventually, uh, eventually, I wrote some poems that I thought were worth keeping, and some of those from like about my freshman year in college actually made it into the book. Um, so that's why uh, poetry is important to me, and why I think if I've been able to do it on a decent level, that matters. As I said later in that introduction, you know, a lot of the stuff I put in the other books, I put it in these other books too because prose was what the publishing climate would let me publish. But if there's an argument for, if there's an argument that makes clear how strong the evidence is for God's existence and how true the gospel, if there's an explanation of a passage of scripture that brings out its meaning, if there is a reflection on the meaning, the purpose of life, and of how our experiences, our full experience as human beings relates to all it. If it's there in the other books, and I hope it is, it's here in its most rich and potent form. Okay.
Mm.
So uh, that's why I think Stars Through the Clouds is an important, maybe the most important book in my bibliography.
Oh,
The
that
title,
was beautiful.
did you get where the title comes from?
Stars through the clouds. If you said it in the book, I didn't catch it. Where
Okay.
did that come from?
When Sam Gamgee is in Mordor and he's tempted because he thinks because Frodo's been captured, he doesn't know if Frodo's still alive. He's tempted to just despair and give up. And he comes up with uh, a poem of basically defiance against the darkness. Though here at journey's end I lie, in darkness buried deep, beyond all towers strong and high, beyond all mountains steep. Beyond all mountains rise the sun, and stars forever dwell. I will not say the day is done. nor bid the stars farewell. So the cloud of Mount Doom in Mordor, and he sees this one star that kind of just pokes through because there's a little hole that lets the light come through, and he gives us that poem. And so I hope that some of these poems might be stars seen through the clouds, uh, like Sam saw in Mordor.
Wow.
Uh,
That is just
that would
gorgeous.
that would be my hope. I wouldn't dare to say that they rise to that level, but that's what they're trying to be.
Receptacles for preserving experience. That is a quote from this interview that is already an instant classic right there.
Mhm.
So fantastic. Um, if you could give a piece of advice to young poets out there, what would that be?
Read the great poets from the past, absorb them, memorize them, because you don't fully get the poem until it's really become part of you, and then do something else for a while. Okay, so uh, if I've been reading Robert Frost, let's say I've just gone through Frost's complete works again to refresh myself, I need to wait a couple of weeks or a month before I start writing, because if I don't, I'll sound like a cheap imitation of Robert Frost.
Mm.
So absorb what the great poets can teach you, and then step away from them far enough so that you can incorporate what they gave you into your own voice. And it's you speaking and not just parroting them. That's one key, I think. Um, and as you read the great poets of the past, you'll notice that they tend to use things like meter and rhyme. Uh, and I would say learn the craft, learn how to do that, because free verse, free verse can be good. There are free verse poems that are powerful, but the problem with free verse is it's so often just prose, arbitrarily broken up into short lines. Okay, uh, and it misses a lot of the tools that a poet has that he can use to craft that receptacle for memory, experience, and meaning that the poem is. So learn the craft and learn from the masters, and then uh, step away from them far enough to where all of that can come through your own voice. Uh, I say something similar in the book that's coming out next month in October. Uh, I've got a book on C.S. Lewis's Apologetics. Deeper Magic is on Lewis's Theology. Answers from Aslan is on Lewis's Enduring Apologetics. And I say, the point of studying Lewis's Apologetics is not that you can learn to parrot his arguments. It's to learn how he did it and let him teach you to do your own apologetic in your own voice for your own audience, your own generation. Um, so it's the same principle. Whether you're whether you're whether you're giving an answer to someone who asks a reason for the hope that is within us, or whether you're just sharing the insights God has given you into the beauty of nature and the pathos of the human condition, uh, you have to find your own voice. Uh, but don't be afraid to absorb those other voices, because they will enrich it if you do it the right way.
Great advice. Well, you've already jumped into one of the questions that I had, and I was going to bring up this upcoming book, Answers from Aslan, the subtitle of The Enduring Apologetics of C.S. Lewis. And as I have been in the apologetics community, and so many of my friends have been in the apologetics community, I'm very excited about this. I think it's going to be a fantastic contribution. We don't want the future generations to become unfamiliar with C.S. Lewis's writings on apologetics because, for instance, Mere Christianity, one of those books that just continues to endure and have an impact in the apologetics community. It is slightly different in that it's dealing specifically with apologetics. So I'm very interested to have a copy of my own, which, by the way, before I forget, all of the books by Dr. Williams that I've been showing you, he has sent me autographed copies. So all of these we will be giving away at some point or another over the next few months. So to enter those giveaways, you'll want to follow his social media. And I hope to get a copy signed of this upcoming book that we can also give away. So first of all, what I notice is that it's got some fantastic endorsements. So I just wanted to read a couple of those. One is by another of our clients, the one who connected you and I, Dr. Douglas Groothuis. He says this about the book, quote, "Do we really need another book on the apologetics of C.S. Lewis? How are so many other able treatments available? Or since there are so many other able treatments available? If it is this book, then yes, there is such a need. Donald Williams makes a unique, helpful, and skillful contribution to the literature on Lewis in particular and apologetics in general. I plan to use Answers from Aslan as a textbook the next time I teach the apologetics of C.S. Lewis, and I heartily endorse it for anyone interested in this subject. May it advance the rational case for Christianity in our day." And then this from analytic philosopher and author Lydia McGrew, whom a lot of our followers will be familiar with. She says, quote, "Dr. Williams's Answers from Aslan offers a detailed, helpful survey and evaluation of the various apologetic arguments of C.S. Lewis. Williams avoids the pitfall of treating imagination and intellect as being in tension, just as Lewis himself avoided it. And this understanding allows him to explain precisely how storytelling fits into a robustly evidence-based Christianity. The inclusion of Williams's own poems as interludes between chapters fits with this overarching theme of a union between the aesthetic and analytical aspects of the Christian mind." Just a wonderful endorsement that really draws out so much of your life put into this work, right? It's the intellectual and the aesthetic synthesized together in a beautiful harmony.
Doug and Lydia are very kind, and Lydia certainly discerns what I'm trying to do, and I hope she's right that I succeeded. One thing that they didn't mention is the real reason why we need this book. It's been 80 years since Lewis wrote Mere Christianity, Miracles, Problem and Pain. They all came out in World War II. The world has changed radically in that time. So one example, in when Lewis is doing the moral argument for theism in Mere Christianity, and he says, probably nobody's going to say, "To hell with your standard." Well, there are a lot of people that'll say that today. So Lewis is able to make some assumptions about his audience 80 years ago we can no longer make about ours today. Where does that leave us? Well, the argument is still a good argument, but it may be harder for people to see that than it was 20, 30, 40, 50, 80 years ago. Chuck Colson famously was converted to Christ by reading the Christianity when he was in prison. I think he's probably about the last generation of people who can just pick the book up and read it and get it. So the argument's still a good argument. It probably is going to need another step or two to get people over the hump of some of those differing assumptions that they have. So I think we're not in a position where we can just hand people mere Christianity. There are some people for whom that might still be a good thing. But increasingly, Lewis actually needs you and me as a bridge between him and the rest of the world. It's ironic, but it's an indication of how much we have dumbed down our educational system over those 80 years, that Lewis, the great popularizer, now needs his own go-between. So we can learn from him. The idea is not that we'll just learn Lewis so we can hand it off. Actually, if you want to do that, that's better than nothing. But Lewis's real function now, I think, is to teach us how to do it better, how to do it as well as he did, so that, as I said earlier, he can teach us to do our own apologetic in our own voice for our own audience. How can Lewis give us that great gift? And I hope that this book will help him keep doing that.
Fantastic. Well, I highly recommend everyone buy 10 copies as soon as it's out and give them all to your friends. It's going to be fantastic. There are other books that we are not going to have time to get to here, so I'm just going to put a promissory note out there and say, we'll do another interview one of these days and get to even more of your literature, because there's just so much out there that you've put out, and it's great content. One of those that we'll have to talk about at some other point, 95 Theses for a New Reformation, another fantastic book. But for now, I think we've gone through some of just your best books and things that I think really, if people pick them up, they're going to learn a lot about you and what it is that you've been able to do in fusing your background in literature and theology that I think is so needed. Professor over at Palm Beach Atlantic, Paul Gould, he's written on the need for enchantment in theology and apologetics. And I think you're the embodiment of that. And so I'm very happy to have you as a client. And we are super privileged to be able to represent you and get your message out to the world. So thank you so much for coming on with me. Are there any last words you want to share with people before we depart for a while?
No pressure there. Let's see. The Southern Appalachians in their autumn glory dressed are all the beauty we can bear, or in which we can rest. The mighty hills of heaven with their oppressive weight would crush our spirits into dust, seen in our present state. But when they burst upon us in sudden majesty, we will be given souls to match and purer eyes to see. From Stars Through the Clouds.
Fantastic.
And I will not finish on a higher note than that.
Well, like I said, you guys need to pick up a copy of that. Stars Through the Clouds. It's a phenomenal poetry book, and just really a perfect example of the type of high quality writing than you can expect from Dr. Williams. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Williams. Again, for all of you guys watching this, please check out all of the links that we have in the description, and please do support Dr. Williams by following him on social media, checking out his books, and sharing them with people that you know. Thank you so much, and God bless.
My pleasure.